join me in welcoming Roxanne and Panchesi.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited about this iteration of SFU History Reads, in no small part because the book is half as long as the one was the last time we did this. So yeah, I want to thank you all for coming out. I think you know that there are snacks and coffee and tea at the back, so you should feel free to help yourselves. As Jennifer said, my name's Roxanne Panchesi, and I'm a historian of modern and contemporary France, and I'm going to be the moderator today. I'm just going to introduce the panel of speakers and talk a little bit about the format for today. So to my immediate right is Muriam Haleh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Cruz, who specializes in French Empire and the post-colonial world in the Middle East and North Africa. To her right is Ferguson, who is professor of history and urban studies at SFU and a specialist in US and African American history. And to her right is Amal Ghazal, who is associate professor and director of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at SFU, and she's a historian of the modern Middle East, specifically the Arab world, as well as Islam in Africa. And to Amal's right is Rudder, who is a scholar, teacher, and activist. He's a faculty member at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Vancouver, and the co-chair of the Hogan's Alley Society here in Vancouver. So welcome, all of you. Thanks so much for joining me. So just to begin to talk a little bit about the format for the next couple of hours, this is a public book club. We're starting with a panel discussion. I have a series of really broad rubrics and questions for the panelists. Sometimes one of them will pipe in, sometimes more. Hopefully we'll get a bit of a conversation going up here at the front of the room to begin with for the first 45 minutes or so. I've got slides and some images and a couple of quotes from the book and questions that will be addressed to the panel, usually starting with one of you to begin with. And then we'll open up the second half to a much broader discussion, hopefully including those of you from the audience who may have questions for the panelists or comments or ideas or thoughts about the book if you've read it, or even if you haven't, ideas or questions that you might have. Okay, so I want to start with a really simple question. What is history? So the historians in this room will know this book by Edward Howlett Carr. That was the book that was the result of a series of lectures and published in 1961. This book, the era, in fact, that Elaine Mokhtefi, it's in there, in the era that she's talking about. What is history? It's a classic book. I struggle with this book. I mean, I have all kinds of fights with it in my mind and out loud. That talks about the question of how we understand what historical truth is, how we might think about facts, the historian and their facts, about society and the individual, about morality and progress, about how cause and effect work. So really, like, what a historian is and what history is at a basic level. So I guess I want to start out by talking about why I picked this book. Yes, I'm interested in Algeria. Yes, I'm interested in France. I'm interested in this period of history. But I was also interested in a book that we could talk about and that could cross over the context of the academy, people working in universities, doing scholarly research, historians working in a more formal way, and a book that would be appealing and interesting to people who might not necessarily have a specific academic interest in history. So I guess I want to start by asking the panelists, maybe starting with Karen, how we might think of Elaine Mokhtefi as a historian. This is a work of history in a way. She's not a formal historian, she's not an academic, but she's engaging with the past. She's got sources and materials that she's working with, and she has an interpretation of the events that she's talking about. So I guess I wanted us to start by talking about what kind of history this is, an autobiography, a political history, how we might think about Elaine Mokhtefi as a historian.
This is on?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I would maybe call this an intimate history. She's very much, it is a memoir. She's talking about her own personal experiences. But as you say, she's a careful memoirist, and I think also, you know, it's very important for her, obviously, too. She's got footnotes, and she is comparing her memories to those of, you know, Kathleen Cleaver, to Eldridge Cleaver, to other of the protagonists in the book. So yeah, so I think it's, yeah, she is she's a historian, I think, and is kind of self-conscious about that, I think, as well. But then can bring this intimate first-person experience to the story.
I was speaking with Muriam last night, and at one point you said something, I don't know if it was to me or to somebody else, about how she gets some things wrong in this book. But she also has these moments where she's very adamant about correcting the record. So I wondered if you wanted to say something about the truth of what Mokhtefi is saying and how she's trying to engage with what really happened.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would want to come forth on the historical truth of this, but certainly, you know, what might separate an intimate history from a professional history is, for example, when she gets into details about Algerian nationalism, you can see that it is an intimate history in terms of how she lived a particular strand of Algerian nationalism, the people she was with. And had there been a footnote there about what professional historians have said, it might be a little bit different. But I do think it's important to take her experience, you know, also as a kind of primary source in that way in thinking about history. And there are a few moments where in the book she's very adamant about clearing the record on some things that are perhaps not important to a general reader who, you know, maybe doesn't need to know who saw Frantz Fanon on his bedside at what day. But she really wants to make sure that she gets that right, and she clears, you know, some questions that I think are really about how she feels history has weighed in on a time period that was, you know, the effects of which are still with us and we're still coming to terms with. So it's interesting to think about this both as a primary and secondary source in that way.
Mm-hmm. Amal, do you want to speak to that at all?
I mean, for me, it's a kind of an eyewitness account, a memoir. I don't consider her as a historian per se. I mean, we have to remember she was a journalist. So, I mean, she kind of, it's not strange that she has footnotes or she compares and contrasts, you know, records, etc. But especially because I do kind of, you know, I'm from the region, doing the history of the region. For me, it's interesting in a sense that, and that's why for me she's not a historian, but you know, like this American lady who wrote this memoir, and it's about Algeria, though in a certain way or in a particular way. It's more about the Black Panthers than about Algerians in general. I mean, like we understand something about we understand about political dynamics, to some extent social dynamics, but the memoir has a particular identity. And I think it depends on what you're doing with that history and where it fits.
Well, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, I guess because it's been a long time since I studied history, and maybe not everyone's historians here, but maybe what is the specific differences between, because you talked about perspective, so a professional historian's perspective and a lay person's perspective. What are the differences between them? Because at this point, yeah, I mean, I'm also struggling with this a lot with Hogan's Alley, because of course we're doing these sort of histories, and a lot of them are first-person accounts, of course. So, you know, even when I was under the rubric of being a historian, I know that it required a lot of input for me to put together these stories in the first place. So, I don't know, I would, in my approach, I would be cautious of comparing her to an actual historian, a real historian, let's say, just because of the ways in which it sort of solidifies a real historian without really talking about one.
Yeah, I think for me the idea is more, you know, how to think about this book as a book that we could read both within, like as academics, but also as non-academics, right? But there were moments when I was reading the book where the details of the political movements that she's talking about, I wondered how interesting or captivating those would be to somebody who wasn't familiar with the period, or who, and maybe we can sort of talk with the audience more about that too, like that there are moments when it seems like a really detailed history of this political movement, and then other moments where she's going back to talking about, how she fell in love with Mokhtar, and it goes back and forth. But what you said got us sort of thinking about, Adam, is a kind of nice transition to the question of, who she is still, and how much this matters to the type of account that she's written about this period, that she was at one point a student. I think in a review of the book that Muriam wrote for Public Books, you say at one point something about, how many hats she wore, that she's a translator, a journalist, a militant, and a jewelry maker. Really wasn't expecting that one. And then a painter. But she's also, over the course of the book, a student, a traveler, a single woman, a married woman, a daughter. There are moments where she talks about her family and her mother. So I guess I have a broad question about how her identity and her various identities, she's a woman, she's white, she's American, she's an outsider in the Algerian context, but also an outsider with respect to the Black Panther Party. She's Jewish, she's from a particular generation, a particular moment. How those things matter to the kind of history and account that she's written here, and the role that she plays at different points in this story. Muriam, do you want to?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say on this, but I think that all of those things are absolutely indispensable and allow us to see, often when you think about the Cold War, Third Worldism, you pick your camp, it's kind of a polarized moment politically, but you can see for her that it's really fraught. There's a moment she wants to lead a workshop in the US, and people are saying, but you're a white woman, how can you lead this workshop? And Kathleen Cleaver has to step in and say, no, this is about a political commitment. And there are moments when she says, I grew up in an anti-Semitic environment and I wanted to think about anti-racism more broadly. So one of the really beautiful things about doing, I like the intimate history, I'll keep coming back to it, is that it's able to weave together hats and stories that don't always show up in the archives the way professional historians tell. I mean, if a professional historian, quote unquote, and I'm aware of the kind of weight of using that as a category, but as a professional training mechanism, it would be really hard to tell a story that's able to capture all of these elements. And there are moments in the book where she could talk about, gender and colonialism and power in a way that's just really poignant because she's telling it through her different analytic kind of capacities.
There's just one thing that I'd like to say about this, which my own expertise maybe can help to contextualize the book a little bit, and that is that this whole thing about her being part of this United World Federalists and being part of this this movement after the Second World War of young people to have a one world government to work towards peace, this sort of left-leaning idea that was started by Henry Wallace, who was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president and a social democrat. It's all very much, there's this generation at the end of the Second World War, before the Cold War is really consolidated, of these social democrats across Europe and North America, who led first by Maurice Sauvé, who was Jeanne Sauvé's husband, for those of you who are a little bit older and remember Jeanne Sauvé, the Governor General of Canada. But these people were worldly people, and this makes her quite an exceptional American, a generation of Americans who actually did know about the world, who knew other languages, who actually claimed themselves to be world citizens. And so she's much different even than the Black Panthers, or maybe that's actually a very striking contrast in the book. Her worldliness gives her a very particular identity and expertise that I don't think of many. We don't really associate with Americans very often, but her generation, her particular generation, and this particular subgroup of people actually did embrace the world and were sophisticated about the world and world politics.
For me also, she represents a moment, kind of, post-colonialism in the region. You had the